And the scripture readings come from Matthew 5, the beginning of Jesus' Sermon on the Mount. Now when he saw the crowds, Jesus went up on a mountainside and sat down. His disciples came to him, and he began to teach them, saying, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those that mourn, for they will be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled. Blessed are the merciful, for they will be shown mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called the children of God. Blessed are those who are persecuted because of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when people insult you, persecute you, and falsely say all kinds of evil against you because of me. Rejoice and be glad, because great is your reward in heaven, for in the same way they persecuted the prophets who were before you." Here ends the readings.
So as I said, I'm taking you a little out of order, out of the series that you have either begun or are in the midst of, mostly because I was in Indiana, coming back from a week off when I got the call telling me that Pastor Lauren was in the hospital and Pastors Ed and Tom were unavailable. So with full disclosure here, I started praying. As we drove through Indiana and Illinois, trying to think of what I could do in less than a day to come up with something for this morning. And I am recycling a sermon that I gave a few weeks ago to a different church, because I felt like this sermon is also especially appropriate for this church, and I hope by the end of it you see why. And as we prepare to enter into the season of Lent, I also thought it would be good again to remind ourselves how Jesus saw his mission when he was here on this earth. Luke tells us that Jesus opened his ministry by entering the synagogue in his hometown, the synagogue that he had attended his entire life, and selecting and reading these crucial words from Isaiah. "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because the Lord has anointed me. He has sent me to preach good news to the poor, to proclaim release to the prisoners and recovery of sight to the blind, to liberate the oppressed, and to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor." This is Jesus' own proclamation, his own understanding of what he had come to do in his life here on earth. He has been sent to the poor, and to the prisoners, and to the blind and the oppressed. He came to proclaim to all who will listen that this time they're living in, is the time of God's favor upon them. And then just a little later, on this hillside, Jesus opens his sermon, the most famous sermon he ever preached, with the words that we just heard. Now, I think we run into a particular danger with this section of the Sermon on the Mount, these Beatitudes as we call them. For one thing, they are so familiar to us, almost too familiar. We read them almost like a poem. And when we do that, we lose a sense of how absolutely astonishing these words are. And secondly, I think we sometimes tend to treat them as self-help isms. I remember a number of years ago, Lee and I were given a book written by a famous televangelist, and the book was called The Be Happy Attitudes. It read a whole lot like a self-help book than a serious theological look at what Jesus was saying here as he began his most famous sermon. And that is unfortunate, because the good news Jesus begins this sermon with is so much greater and more profound than a self-help rally. Imagine for a moment, if you would, this particular hillside filled with thousands of people who have heard rumors of a man who heals, who says the kinds of things that no one has dared say before. They have gathered, they may have come from miles to see and to hear for themselves this peculiar rabbi from Galilee. Now, as I imagine this hillside, I see people who are desperate to experience healing for either themselves or a loved one. I see a mix of people who are cynical, people who feel helpless, people who are tired of living in fear, tired of being taxed, almost beyond the point of going hungry, people tired of living under a constant threat. Some of them may have been tired of living as the people of God who no longer remember the commands of God. I see people who remember the stories of when their ancestors ruled their own fate, when people lived by the law, and when people felt the protection of God around them. I see outcasts, and the poor, and the afraid, and the grieving, and the angry. Jesus looked out over this crowd of people, and he said, "Blessed are the poor in spirit. Blessed are the meek. Blessed are the peacemakers. Blessed are the merciful. Blessed are the mourners. Blessed are you who are misunderstood and persecuted." Now, does that not strike you as preposterous? If not, consider what such a sermon might sound like today. Blessed are you whose addiction has cost you everything you once valued. Blessed are you. Blessed are you sitting there so depressed you can't even imagine getting out of bed tomorrow. You are blessed. Blessed are you who have experienced an unspeakable loss. A couple of weeks ago, one of my colleagues was asked to do the funeral service of a toddler whose 5 siblings had already been placed in foster care. Loss after loss, pain, damage, heartache. Can you imagine for 1 minute telling that family, "Blessed are you"? We would never say that, would we? Or how about the people who can't sleep at night, so bothered by the injustice and unrighteousness that fills our news stories? Blessed are you? How about the nurses who work in understaffed hospitals, who are buried in paperwork, who work through their lunch only to have a patient yell because it took too long to answer the bell? Blessed are you. Blessed are you police officers who promise to protect and defend, to put your lives on the line to keep others safe, to keep the peace among us, only to discover that there are people who have put a target on your back. Blessed are you? Blessed are you soldiers who answer the call to protect your country, only to find yourselves in a foreign country that doesn't want you there, unsure who wants to help you and who wants to kill you. Blessed are you who are there to keep peace. These are astonishing statements to make. And if we don't stick with them long enough to get at the truth of what Jesus is pointing at, we run the risk of taking these lightly and surfacely and shallowly, and then making truly hurtful statements ourselves to those around us who are suffering. Statements like everything happens for a reason, or God never gives you more than you can bear. So what is it that Jesus is saying to these people who are desperate enough to drag themselves to this hillside? I don't think Jesus just pulled these pronouncements, these Beatitudes, out of thin air. I believe Jesus looked out over this crowd and he spoke to what he saw. The poor in spirit, the mournful, the meek, the merciful, the peacemakers. And so I believe that what Jesus was saying to these people on the hillside, and by extension to you and to me, to all people who suffer, to people who find themselves in thin places, is, you are seen. I see you. God sees you. You do not walk this path alone. All of these groups of people that Jesus names here, these are who he sees gathered on this hillside. And he tells them that they are seen. Blessed are you who despair and can't even find words to describe your pain. God sees you. You are not as alone as you sometimes feel. Blessed are you who are overwhelmed by grief, whose friends and relatives are beginning to wish you could just get over it. God sees your tears. God knows your heartache. Blessed are those of you who feel powerless and overlooked and walked on. God sees you. Blessed are you who are sometimes filled with fury and sometimes overwhelmed with sadness as you look at the mess and the pain in this world. God shares your concern, and it is God's desire too to see good overcome bad. Blessed are you who refuse to give in to that knee-jerk reaction to hurt when you have been hurt, but rather offer kindness. God sees the hard work that takes. Blessed are you who consistently show mercy when it is deserved and when it is not. Blessed are you for the many kindnesses you show when no one is looking. God sees those kindnesses. God knows what you are doing. Blessed are you when people misunderstand you, when people judge you and find you wanting. Blessed are you when people make fun of you for your beliefs. God sees you, and God honors your faith. We all have defining stories in our lives, and blessing comes from having those stories be recognized. Blessing comes from being seen, from being known. So as I'm spending a fair amount of time in the car these days, I listen to the radio more than I used to. And I'm often listening to either NPR or classical music. And one of my favorite programs I have discovered on NPR is called StoryCorps. And I'm sure some of you are familiar with that. It's usually on Saturday afternoons, I think. But this program plays recordings of different people who have come to one of their recording booths to tell a story about their lives. Oftentimes they will bring a friend or a family member, somebody that they want to know this particular story about themselves. I remember one story from a few years back when an elderly grandfather brought his grandson to one of these story booths. Now, this elderly African-American grandfather wanted to share his story with his grandson of how he had enlisted to serve his country. I think this was during the end of World War II. And yet one day when he was home on leave, he went with his friends to see a movie, and he wasn't allowed in because of the color of his skin. He wanted his grandson to understand that part of their family history. People usually choose to tell stories in these story booths that are instrumental in forming them into the people that they are today. They're important stories to them. And a few weeks ago, as I was driving home listening to a few of these stories, I realized that what I like about this program is that it highlights that every one of us has a story. You can't help, as you are listening to somebody else tell their story, think about, what story would I share? If I went into these booths, what is the story that is so important in my life that I really want a family member or a close friend to know about this story? I want this story recorded somewhere. Every one of us has a few stories that play a part in defining us. And I think that Jesus on this hillside begins his message by calling out people's stories. And he reminds us that God knows our stories. God sees each one of us enough to know which of those stories define us. But God doesn't just see the stories that we hold on to. God sees the whole story, the greater story. Jesus also reminds us that what we might be holding on to is not the end of the story, and that God does see our stories through to their best ending. The only way these Beatitudes make sense is to finish the sentence on each one. Blessed are you who feel beaten down by this life, who battle depression, who despair of life ever getting better. God has prepared the kingdom of heaven for you. Blessed are you who grieve, whose world has been turned upside down and will never be the same. Your emptiness will be made whole again. Blessed are you who are humble, who have not bought into the idea that you are number one, that you deserve the best, that you need to be first in line. Blessed are you who put others first, who live to serve. The world has been created for you, and no one less than God will see to your inheritance. Blessed are you who are so bothered by injustice, by unrighteousness, who feel so keenly the separation from God that it eats at you like a hunger. Blessed are you who long to see justice roll down from the mountains, and righteousness fill every home, even your own heart. You shall one day experience and witness these very things. Your longing will be answered. Blessed are you who are ever ready to speak a kind word, who respond with helping rather than judgment, who give until it hurts a little bit. God sees your acts of mercy, and God will be merciful to you. Blessed are you who manage to walk through this world with pure hearts, whose greatest capacity is love, who are often thought of as naive or uncool. You have the capacity to see God. Blessed are you who work for peace, who listen more than you talk, who work for understanding. Blessed are you who show the power of a kind word or a helping hand. By your actions, you display the family inheritance resemblance. There is no doubt that you are God's own children. Blessed are you who are judged, misunderstood, or simply harassed, because you have dedicated yourselves to living as God calls you to live. Blessed are you who choose Christ over and over again, even if it costs you. The reward for such faithfulness is great, so awesome that you won't even remember the pain and the loss. God sees you. God sees the stories that define you, but God has a bigger story, a story that can bring you safely home, a story that can fill you with hope, no matter where you find yourself. So when Lee worked at the detention center in Kentucky, he had this coworker named Debbie, who was one of the guards at this detention center. Now, Debbie was a very tall, very big woman, and she was tough as nails. And she loved nothing more than to be in the middle of a fight. And so I think she actually looked forward to the inmates under her supervision testing her, because she got to show them in a very physical way who was going to be boss in that cell block. Well, over the years that Lee worked there, Debbie got to know him, and eventually, it took probably 5 or 6 years, but eventually she started coming to the church where he was the pastor. And as we got to know her better, we discovered that this was the first church she had ever attended. Once when she was a child, she went to Vacation Bible School. She showed up on a Tuesday instead of a Monday and was told if she couldn't come every night, she shouldn't come at all. That was the last time she'd been in a church. Now she was in her probably mid-30s or close to 40. Well, after a few months of attending church, Debbie decided that she wanted to be baptized. And I have almost never seen anybody as excited about a baptism as she was. When we gave her her baptismal certificate, she exclaimed, "I'm framing this and I am hanging it on the wall next to my high school diploma. It's the best thing that's ever happened to me." Debbie's story changed over those months, and she found a peace that she had never felt before, and she didn't need to fight to prove her strength or her worth. But then a close, very close friend, lifelong friend of hers, died in a drowning accident. That was more than 20 years ago, and Debbie never got over that loss. In fact, just a few months ago, I saw a posting that she had put on Facebook that was just talking again about how desperately she missed this person and how she thought about him every day. And it was just so hard to be alive when he was not alive. And then a few weeks ago, I heard from a friend that Debbie had died of pancreatic cancer. And you know, the first thought that I had when I heard that news was that she would mourn no more. That God had answered her deepest pain and longing. I hope that you see that these verses aren't meant to be an encouragement for us to heal ourselves, because we can't. If that were the case, then these verses wouldn't be good news at all. Jesus proclaims here that we are not alone, that God walks with us through the stories of our lives when we can feel his presence and when we cannot. God is still there, and that while we may not see it yet, there will come a time when all will be well. And then I want you to consider this. Jesus doesn't just speak this sermon. He lives it every single day of his life on this earth, every day of his ministry. He lives it by seeing the people that nobody bothers to look at, the lepers, the prostitutes, the sick, the disabled, the outcasts, the tax collectors, the Roman soldiers. Even from the cross, Jesus continues to see these people. He sees them and he sees their stories, and somehow he manages to turn their stories upside down. No matter their old story, their new story becomes a song of praise. There is probably nothing we can do that is so like Christ as seeing one another as Christ sees us. Seeing the stories that other people carry around, but also knowing by faith that there is a greater story a story of healing and reconciliation and possibility. That is the good news that we carry around within ourselves, that God has entrusted us to share with the world. A world of people who feel like outcasts. A world of people who feel unseen and unheard and uncared for. What would happen if we all prayed every day when we got up that we would have eyes like Jesus had? That we would be able to see with compassion, with patience, and with understanding. If every one of us would keep in mind that for every person we meet, the story we see isn't the whole story, and that God sees them just as God sees us. I think about the people in my life that I love, and I hope that I can see and honor their stories. I also think about the people in my life that it is really hard to love. And I pray that God can help me see and honor their stories as well. Because that, I believe, is how we change the world. Would you please pray with me? Holy and gracious God, thank you for sending us your Son, who came into this world and saw and experienced this life as we live, who spoke out loud our condition, who offered us such good news, who spent his life showing us how to see one another, especially those who often go unnoticed. Help each of us to remember the good news of these verses, that you see us and you know us and you walk with us, that you know our needs better than we do, and that your end to our story is so much greater than any we could write for ourselves. Give us this hope and enable and guide us to share it with others. In the name of Jesus Christ, our Lord and Savior, we pray. Amen.